First Person is produced in cooperation with the Far East Broadcasting Company, who rejoice in the stories of changed lives through the power of Jesus Christ. Learn more at febc.org.
Just look at who's aligning against Ukraine, and it really, I think, is a call. When we see our brothers and sisters suffering, we scream out, we say, hey, look, here's a movie about this, here's information about this. Fellow brothers and sisters, you need to see what's going on.
An important documentary film on the persecution of the church in Ukraine has been released and is available online, and we'll talk with the executive producer of the film today here on First Person. Welcome, I'm Wayne Shepherd. To learn more about today's guest and topic, I invite you to join us online at firstpersoninterview.com. There you'll find a link to the film we'll talk about in a few moments, along with links to organizations who are helping with the crisis in Ukraine. Just go to firstpersoninterview.com. And thanks goes to the Far East Broadcasting Company for helping to make today's interview available. Learn more about FEBC, including its ministry in Ukraine, when you visit febc.org. Our guest, Colby Barrett, is an entrepreneur, filmmaker, and former U.S. Marine Corps captain who led infantry and scout sniper platoons in the Pacific Rim and Middle East. One of his businesses is a peach orchard in Colorado where he lives with his family. But a trip to Ukraine impacted his life's journey, and he joined me online to talk about it.
Wayne, first of all, thanks for having me on and for bringing prayer and awareness to this important issue and to speak out about our film, A Faith Under Siege. I was born and raised in Western Colorado and was not raised in the church. I actually ended up in Navy ROTC on an aircraft carrier for a summer where a friend had given me the Bible, and I read the whole thing, and it made a lot of sense to me. Wow. And so I was baptized in Yokosuka, Japan by Chaplain Alan Allen, and then went on to serve in the Marine Corps. I led a successful business that grew to about 900 people, and we actually currently run a organic peach orchard in Colorado. So what you'll hear there is nothing in my background talks about documentary filmmaking.
Right, yeah, and we're going to explore that. And it says nothing about Ukraine either, does it?
That's right. I was joking with somebody that I think before this project came up, I don't know that I knowingly met a Ukrainian person. Of course, I probably have, but no Ukrainian relatives, had never been there, no real connection to the country. But I got a call this past summer from a friend from graduate school, and he said, hey, we're taking an aid convoy into Ukraine. You were in the military. This might be right up your alley. And my response was, absolutely not. You know, there's a war there. And then I went on to, all my great excuses. I got 4 kids there. It's in the middle of harvest at our farm. We're in the middle of selling our construction company. I had all these awesome reasons not to go. But what I felt when I hung up that phone was a pull to at least learn a little bit more about what's going on before it was a firm no. And that's where some of the research led to some things that I found to be frankly shocking. And I feel like I try to keep up with current events. I watch the news. I try to know what's going on in the world. But the statistics we saw were just crazy. At the time, 630 churches shelled, looted, or destroyed by Russia. 47 pastors and priests killed, and 19,546 Ukrainian children abducted.
And this is 3 years ago, right?
This is, sadly, those numbers are higher, right? So it's 650 churches now, 49 priests and pastors. And that shocked me in a way that I've not been shocked before. And I felt this real call from the Holy Spirit to say, not only go, but if you didn't know about this, how many other Christians in America also don't know about this? And that's where that pull for, to actually do a documentary was put on my heart. And, that's the rest is kind of what you've seen in the film. We got it done in March, and it's now been on CBN and Newsmax and TBN. It's free on YouTube. So this is not a project where we're trying to make any money. So if you just get on faithundersiege.com, it'll bring you to a YouTube link. You can watch the whole thing for free.
Yeah, and I've watched it 3 or 4 times. So I really appreciate what you've done. But a peach orchard farmer in Colorado just doesn't start making documentary films. Was it the trip that really ignited this?
I think the people I met through this was a guy named Christian Hickey. And this Christian Hickey's a fantastic person, an amazing background. He was a Marine, a police officer, a former, or actually still is a Special Forces Green Beret. And what Christian says is God will use your past chapters in your life for what you're meant to be doing right now. And that was something that I was like, well, what in my past helps with a documentary film? I don't have that. But I was a Marine officer. I was a CEO. I've built teams before.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really where I think that God was using me, is to say, hey, get these people together and great things will happen. And that's really what we were able to do. We found an amazing film crew, one of the best in Ukraine. We were very insistent that Ukrainians film this. However, we wanted to make sure post-production was here because our main audience is Americans. And then the last piece was, how do you get in and talk to these Christians about the worst day they've ever had in their life, about the time that they lost a loved one, the time they were tortured, the time that they lost their church? I'm just some dude from Colorado. Like, I can't really show up and get that. And that's where we linked up with a nonprofit called the Ukraine Freedom Project. And those guys are doing amazing work. And they had all these connections with these Christians, with these churches, and we were able to get in there and do that filming. And I would say too, I didn't know any better because it's the first documentary, but it went great. Everything was on time. Nothing broke. Everything was just literally perfect to it. I would say statistically improbable level. And I really felt that, in retrospect, really God's hand on this mission, because we traveled 1,200 miles across the entire front line.
Yeah.
The cities we were in were bombed either before we got there, after, or while we were there, depending on the city. Sometimes we were 10 miles from the front lines. We could hear artillery. We could hear drones. And, God's hand was really on this.
Yeah.
We were able to film, talk to all the people that came sometimes from more dangerous places to come see us, weren't harmed. They're all of the people from the film are alive today. One of the pastors has been hit by Russian drones a sixth time, unfortunately, but is still unscathed. So
Wow.
I really felt like God's hand was on this project and this story.
Yeah. Many of our listeners know I've had some of those same experiences that you had. Have you been back since that filmmaking trip?
Yes. I was there about a month ago in Lviv and Kyiv and Odessa. We did not go closer to the front lines on this trip, but we were able to go up north into some of the areas that Russia had occupied, but were liberated later by Ukrainian forces, really to explore more of the depth of the suppression of faith on the behalf of the Russians. So the film is really mostly focused on evangelicals and Protestants, their experience in this war, but it's not limited to the persecution of faith is really not limited to Protestants and evangelicals. We talk to Catholics, Jewish folks, Orthodox, and all have kind of similar stories of persecution of their faith at the hands of the invading Russian forces.
I want to dig a little deeper on that in a few moments, but describe for me, how did you handle the emotions of first setting foot in Ukraine and hearing these stories and seeing these bombed churches and hearing and talking with people whose families were wiped out by the attacks? How did you handle all that?
I think my thought would be that I would be very scared over there. As I mentioned, I did serve in the Marine Corps, but not in active combat, mostly kind of peacetime type stuff. But we were always with believers from Ukraine, and you could feel their resilience, their hope, their lack of fear really just pervaded the entire trip for me.
Isn't that
so I
true?
I don't, this isn't because I'm brave. I don't recall being scared over there. Even when we were really close to the front line. The most emotional piece for me was coming into a church, a big evangelical church in Kyiv. It's essentially like a mega church, and we were late. As you probably recall from your time over there, when there's air raid alerts, they jam the GPS. And so we were late. We couldn't find the church. The Google Maps wasn't working. And so as we're walking in, it was right in the middle of the opening praise songs, and I just lost it. And the reason was it felt physically like coming into my home. So a stressful war zone. It felt like I was opening my door and coming into my home in Western Colorado. That feeling of being home. It was just waterworks.
Yeah.
So that was probably the biggest, emotional piece. Talking with people that had lost their families, especially recently, we talked with Yaroslav Basilevich, and he's a Catholic believer from Lviv whose entire family was wiped out. So three daughters, and his young wife killed by a Russian hypersonic missile.
Terribly sad story. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And this was 16 days after this happened. We interviewed him, and that was tough. That is pain that's not been processed. And, that pain kind of washed over the film crew there. So it was every night after filming, I had about a 5-minute cry. I would pray and then get back to work. But yeah, certainly some heartbreaking stories there.
We'll continue to learn about this new film and its executive producer, Colby Barrett, when we continue with First Person in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Ed Cannon, and as you know, situations around the world are changing quickly. Stay current with FEBC's ministry and get a deeper understanding of people who need to find hope. Hear how you can feel the pulse of God's Spirit moving through the hearts of believers dedicated to reaching the lost. Be sure you join me for the podcast Until All Have Heard.
Discover how the gospel is making a difference around the world. Search for Until All Have Heard on your favorite podcast platform, or hear it online at febc.org. Once again, my guest is Colby Barrett, who is the executive producer of a film that I really urge you to watch. It's on YouTube. It's widely available. It's called A Faith Under Siege, telling the story of persecuted Christians in Ukraine. And I'm so glad that you touched on a controversy that came out of nowhere, Colby, and that is this Russian propaganda. I have to call it that Ukraine is persecuting Christians itself. And can we address that for a moment? What did you discover, and what do you portray in the film?
Yeah, Wayne, thanks for bringing that up. Propaganda is the right word, but when you think about propaganda, the best propaganda has a kernel of truth, right? So the Kremlin narrative is the Ukrainian government is persecuting Orthodox Christians really unfairly. And the kernel of truth in that is there are two Orthodox churches in Ukraine. One has a center of power in Kyiv. It's called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or the OCU. And then confusingly, there's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the UOC. And the UOC is historically always reported to Moscow, and still actually has a lot of connections to Moscow. And a number of their priests have been imprisoned for preaching surrender, calling in artillery strikes for the Russians, hiding weapons, really assisting the Russians in the war effort. And so about in September, I think, of last year, the Ukrainian government passed a law saying, hey, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, you guys need to sever your ties with Moscow. You can't continue to have a power center in a nation that's attacking us. And that's where the Kremlin was able to spin that and say, oh, they're banning our church, or they're jailing our priests. And it's really an unfortunate kind of thing. But when you look at the historical parallels to the U.S., it's actually kind of interesting, because we fought a revolution against England. The biggest church at the time was the Church of England, and the Church of England priests were actually they swore an oath to God and to the king. which is obviously an issue. And so that's why we have Episcopalians now. The Continental Congress passed similar laws saying, hey, you need to sever your ties with this hostile foreign power. So it's really a national security issue. There's nobody in Ukraine and Ukrainian government that is trying to stop faith or ban churches. They're just really saying, hey, you can't have a foreign power controlling you. And
but the Russians want you to believe that the Ukraine is the bad guy here, don't they?
Right, exactly. And it's a great kind of counter narrative, and unfortunately pretty widely distributed. But I think one thing that people don't understand is Russia spends somewhere between 1.6 and 2.4 billion dollars on overseas propaganda every year. So they have a huge war chest to push these kind of narratives. And our film was self-funded. We certainly don't have $1 billion budget, but I think that's what the good thing is, that truth wins in those kind of struggles. And so that was really a part of the film, was to address that controversy. So Christians in America had good information about what's really going on there. So
in the film, you interview pastors, a number of them, about their experience, including some whose services were literally invaded by Russian forces.
Yes.
Talk about those moments.
One of the pastors we talked to, Reverend Britson, who you know, was holding services, and this is a few days after the Russian had invaded his city, and a special forces troop came up on the stage in the middle of services, stopped services. Thankfully, the camera was still rolling, so we have amazing footage from this. Sent everybody down to the church basement, checked everybody's passports, and they essentially took over that church. It is now a Russian cultural center, that church there, which is, personally just hard to hear. But when you talk to Reverend Britson about that, this flourishing Protestant church in Ukraine that was doing so much good for their congregation and for the community is now a place where they hold, dance parties and Russian citizenship ceremonies. It really, it feels like replacing worship of God with worship of the state, just in the way it feels.
Another important part of this story, Colby, and you touch on this in the film, is all the Ukrainian children abducted by Russian forces and basically kidnapped to Russia. You report on this in the film, but the number's only grown since the film was produced, right?
It has. The lowest number that you would see for abducted, so Ukrainian children abducted by Russia, is 19,546. So that'd be the names that the Ukrainian authorities know these children were taken. There's a very systematic effort there. Russia has set up a series of 43 re-education camps in Russia and Russian-occupied territory to essentially take these kids and erase their Ukrainian identity, turn them into Russian kids, and then the follow-on is to militarize them. So eventually they can come back and fight against Ukraine or the West, depending on kind of which war they're looking forward to. So really just it's a tragic episode. In terms of kids coming back, I think the Russian government has promised to free 5 of them. Wow. So tens of thousands, they've promised to free 5 of them. Thankfully, there's some great nonprofits that are working in this space. Save Ukraine is one of them. We highlight them in the film. They've brought back around 700 so far. A few other nonprofits are working. I want to say the combined total is something just under 1,500 kids. But if you really look at the stats that Russia would be talking about, they would say it's more like 730,000 children. And that would be children that, not just orphans that are abducted, but children with their parents. And they use those numbers almost in a gloating fashion, because Russia's birth rate right now is the lowest it's been since the 1800s. There's absolutely no hope in their society. And so people rightly aren't having kids. So that's how they're trying to Putin's trying to bolster the population, is, hey, if I can steal a bunch of kids and indoctrinate them, I've pushed my problem out maybe another decade of demographic collapse.
Well, it breaks your heart to think about all those lives disrupted that way, and these children taken and reprogrammed, so to speak.
Right.
Brainwashed, really. It's a tragedy that we need to continue praying about and pray that many more children will be rescued from this fate. It really is very, very sad. As a filmmaker, where do you go from here? A Faith Under Siege is being seen by more and more people in the West all the time. Where do you go from here? And you describe this as a pivotal moment for the church in the West. Can you talk about that for a moment?
I think the next steps with the documentary, obviously we've been on Newsmax and CBN and TBN. We're on YouTube right now. We've got, I think, 115,000 views the last time I checked. So an amazing response. What I would ask your listeners to do is consider not just watching this, A Faith Under Siege, but screening it with your church. On our website, we've got a way to do a church screening. Again, it's all free. There's a discussion guide and a prayer guide. All that stuff is on there. We found that people watching this really impacts their understanding of the whole situation. But if you watch it with your small group or your Bible study group or your whole church, the discussion that comes from that can be really, really impactful. And I think in terms of the response of the global church on what's going on here is really to understand this isn't Orthodox versus Protestant or anything like that. It really is it's an assault on faith itself. If you look at authoritarian regimes, faith is very disruptive to them. It's the same reason that the church is banned in North Korea, right? Because faith is one of the few things that can bring authoritarianism down. And so this is something that I think is actually very interesting in terms of who's aligning with Ukraine and who's aligning against Ukraine. The guys that are fighting in Ukraine right now are Russia. And then North Korea is sending troops to fight there too. They've found some Chinese troops. The communist country of Laos, which is another not real safe place to be a Christian, is sending them. And then if you listen to the skies in Ukraine at night, you'll hear the buzz of Iranian Shahed drones, sometimes up to 500 per night. So you just look at who's aligning against Ukraine, and it really, I think, is a call for us as the global Christian body, first, to not be indifferent on this. When we see our brothers and sisters suffering, we scream out. We say, hey, look, here's a movie about this. Here's information about this. Here's what's going on. And then whatever we're called to do to remove that pain, whether it's prayer or donating to nonprofits that are bringing kids back or going there to volunteer to build houses or bring aid. But I would emphasize the power of prayer in this struggle for sure.
Colby makes a great point that whatever we're called to do begins with prayer, and I appreciate his response to the call in his life to serve the people and church of Ukraine with this film. Our guest has been Colby Barrett, the producer and executive producer of the documentary film A Faith Under Siege, telling the story of the persecuted wartime church in Ukraine. You can actually view the film online at youtube.com, and we'll place a link to it at firstpersoninterview.com. We'll also have links to both Mission Eurasia and the Far East Broadcasting Company, who are very actively involved in spiritual support and aid in Ukraine. You'll find all of these links at firstpersoninterview.com, and you can also listen to this and other interviews at the same website, firstpersoninterview.com. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us next time for First Person.